Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
Hello, gentlemen. Today I'm going to be bringing you behind the scenes in my learning process, or should I say unlearning process, in an area of my life where I am woefully undereducated. Back in November, I hired my very first sex, LGBTQ+, and gender studies coach, Cory Bush. More on her in just a bit. Now, why would I do such a thing, you might ask? Well, over the years, I started feeling a strong pull from my inner compass to answer some of these recurring questions I had about myself, like, why don't I have more gay friends? Why don't I know anyone who's transgender? What do I do about the shame I carry from having made gay jokes when I was younger? How do I wrap my arms around the ever-evolving world of language of the LGBTQ+ community, like pronouns, they, theirs, them, or what cisgender means, or what the difference is between biological sex, gender identity, and gender presentation is, all of which we get into in today's episode. And I also want to know, how do I not let the fear of tripping over myself and offending someone prevent me from entering conversations and spaces that aren't built for me, where I am the minority? So you might be wondering, well, hey, Dom, that's interesting, but what's the benefit of this type of inquiry? Well, guys, I grew up with a sister who has special needs, right? My beloved sister, Mary, who I talk about on the show all the time. And I've had a chance to witness firsthand, up close and personal, the life experience of my sister, Mary, someone who has been marginalized by our society. Guys, it can be fucking brutal, lonesome, and oppressing for that person. Now, if you juxtapose that with my experience as a straight, white, able-bodied, affluent man, my life experience has been one where I've been accepted nearly everywhere I go. And I want to be very clear, I carry no shame around that, right? Like, this is how I was born into this body in this particular way. I'm grateful for that. I've been blessed and privileged. And it's only now, over these last few years, that I've been awakening to the understanding of how to use this privilege to hear the voices of those who are muffled and misunderstood. Because just as my sister Mary has become one of my greatest spiritual teachers in the arenas of love, acceptance, and patience, I am certain that the people in the communities that I've made very little active effort in engaging with up to this point can teach me a hell of a lot about life. And in return, help to infuse some of my privilege to raise their voices, to bring awareness, right? So that there's less oppression. And that's one of the things I've been able to do with my sister Mary, is shining a light on her gifts and her magic and her beauty has brought a deeper level of understanding to those who don't understand someone who's got special needs like my sister, who instead of looking at her strangely because she likes to wear all different sorts of crazy clothes, they can now see it for what it is, which is her living her best life. So in a few short months of doing this work with Cory Bush, I've experienced a number of benefits that I think are out there and available for you as well, like educating myself in areas where I've been ignorant and exposing my blind spots, exposure to a dynamic world of diverse, talented, and vibrant people whose stories are equally heartbreaking and inspiring. I've been learning the language that honors and respects the LGBTQ+ communities. I've learned how to receive being corrected and how to be criticized when I've inadvertently triggered someone with my own ignorance or lack of awareness. And I've been reducing my shame around these areas of my life where I have been ignorant or unaware. So wherever you are on your journey, I invite you to listen in on this conversation closely because it's important. And we have an excellent guide for our discussion today, Cory Bush, who you'll hear will introduce herself in just a moment. And of course, your favorite boy, Brian, is here today as well. So enjoy today's episode on lessons from my sex, LGBTQ+, and gender studies coach featuring Cory Bush. So recently, we eclipsed kind of a milestone for us on the Great Man Within podcast, Brian. We hit over 200 episodes in the first 2 years of doing our work. So first of all, congratulations, buddy. We made it.
Congratulations to you.
Congratulations to both of us.
Very exciting. I think we've covered all the topics except.
But you've spoken too soon. We've covered many topics. And this is the first kind of conversation that we are going to be having in a different realm today. And I'm excited to introduce you to a coach of mine that I've been working with over the past month and a half. Cory, welcome to the show. And please introduce yourself to our listeners of the Great Man Within podcast.
Well, thank you both for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. My name is Cory Bush. I am a sex educator and doula. I've been working in the sex education space now for 3 years, and I have been a doula for almost a year now. I took my training in March. A lot of the work that I do in sex education has been related to monogamy, kink, overall sexual pleasure, sexual health, communication in relationships, platonic and otherwise. And now I have kind of transitioned into the doula space where I support people in labor during the postpartum period as well as during the prenatal period, which is why when Dominic reached out to me, I was caught by surprise a little bit.
I'm not your target market.
It's interesting because as a coach, you want to keep yourself open to as many populations as possible, but also, it's wise to hone in on a niche. And so it was interesting that at this moment when I'm honing in on this niche, I started transitioning my content online to be more focused on birth and doula world, birth work in general. I made a story because I was getting a lot of just frankly inappropriate comments from men in my comments when I would post photos of people laboring or just talking about birth and everything. And I was like, okay, I need to reset the container that is my account. Because I get it. Like, I've been posting more sexual empowerment related content up until this point. And so people I'm making a hard left turn and I have to kind of tell people where we're going. And so I made a story, and it was basically just very blunt. It was like, if you are a cisgender man, this story is for you. This content moving forward on this account is not going to center you. And that's okay. That does not mean you're not allowed to be in this space. You're allowed to observe. You're allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to engage with this content. You're allowed to be here. But what you're not allowed to do is derail my comment section or insert yourself into situations that just frankly don't involve you right now. I set that container. I got a lot of great response and feedback from that from a lot of cisgender men, which was good to hear. And then I want to say about 2 days later, that's when you, Dominic, reached out to me via Instagram.
Yeah, it was something that had been building for quite some time, Cory. And then that story actually was kind of the clincher for me, ironically. And I know that surprised you. For our audience who may not know what cisgender means, how about a quick definition on that? And then we'll talk about what I reached out to you and the request to engage in the work was.
Yeah, totally. So definition of cisgender means that your gender identity matches up with the biological sex that you were assigned at birth. In the case of Dominic and Brian are cisgender men because their gender identities match up with their biological sex that was assigned to them at birth. I am non-binary, so I am actually not cisgender. I am part of the trans community. I am cissexual, which is a term that actually not a lot of people know. And that means that I am comfortable in my biological body. I don't have the desire to go on hormone replacement therapy or undergo any surgery or any medical side of transitioning. So that's a little crash course for gender identity. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that a little bit later as well.
2 more follow-up questions for you on that, Cory. What are your pronouns?
Thank you.
And then, first of all, what are your pronouns?
I use they, them, and she, her pronouns interchangeably.
Got it. Thank you. And also, for someone who's just approaching this conversation for the first time, biological sex and gender, I remember coming to you and thinking like, well, gender is not something that's assigned. It's not a choice. It's just, it's what you are, right? And so help to pick apart that. And biological sex is not a choice. It's what you are biologically, but gender is. And maybe help go down that path a little bit.
Yeah. So there's a really great learning tool that they use for like kids sex education called the Genderbread Person. And it does a really great job of kind of breaking up the differences in these things. So you have biological sex, and that refers to your genitalia. There are more than 2 biological sexes. You have people with penises, you have people with vulvas, vaginas, you have intersex people. But in terms of chromosomes, I believe there's 6 different configurations, chromosomal configurations that influence biological sex. So intersex is not necessarily like a one thing. There's a lot of different chromosomal variations when it comes to intersex. So that's biological sex. That specifically refers to the parts that you were born with. Gender identity is specifically related to how you personally identify in terms of your gender. So a lot of people identify as a woman. Great. A lot of people identify as a man. Great. I identify as non-binary. There are people who identify as genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, so many configurations. And if you are trans or a trans man or a trans woman, that means that you were born with what we would normally consider male or female parts, which we now know that genitalia does not have gender. It's just genitalia. It's just what we have. And so a trans man is someone who was not assigned like male at birth, but now identifies as a man. And that is regardless of how far into this person's transition that they are. You can be a trans man or a trans woman without taking a single hormone or going under any surgery. It's truly just about how you feel, how you identify in your soul, in your brain as yourself. And that is different from gender presentation. And I know that's something that we talked about in our sessions is separating this thing. So gender presentation, that can kind of fall into the spectrum of like masculine and feminine. As a society, we have deemed certain things to be masculine and certain things to be feminine. And so when we talk about gender presentation, that gives us another layer of separation that is different from gender identity, which is different from biological sex. I would say, like, for example, my gender presentation teeters on androgynous to more femme, depending on how I'm feeling. And gender presentation is something that can change day to day, month to month, year to year, based on different circumstances. I think, like in certain spaces, I may present more femme, and in certain spaces, I may present more androgynous or more masculine. But all of those things are different and they're all fluid, and they can, with gender identity and gender presentation, they can change as much as you want them to.
That's awesome. The 3 terms here that were really helpful for me, the biological sex, the gender identity, and the gender presentation, right? And so those were the 3 things that you educated me on. And one of the things that we're going to do as we get into this conversation today is just kind of give you a glimpse into my unlearning process, and that's one of the reasons why, Cory, I reached out to you. Bri, like, I know this is kind of your first interaction with the 2 of us in this journey here. So please ask the questions that, our listeners would want to know about. But to kind of set the stage for, Cory, why I reached out to you in the first place is I've been on this journey for the past number of years, just recognizing how many blind spots I've had in my life, right? And being someone who is a straight white man who grew up in a pretty homogenous environment, I didn't recognize how much privilege I had. I didn't recognize how much the world was catered towards me because I had the privilege of not necessarily thinking about it. There were very few moments where I was ever confronted with my own identity, like those times where I would leave the suburbs of Ramsey, New Jersey, and I would go to a Yankee game and be in the Bronx, New York, and being in totally a different environment. I could feel the difference, but it was only temporarily speaking. Or if I was in a particular party where people were predominantly a different sexual orientation than mine, I could feel my identity in a much different way. But these were very like one-off scenarios that never really forced me to think too deeply around my blind spots. And so, Bri, you know how for the past few years when Me Too hit and you and I started going to a number of events where it was primarily 98% audience of women and we were the outliers, and we had a chance to kind of confront some of those uncomfortable situations and hear different perspectives, it really kicked off this new level of inquiry around, where has my head been buried in the sand? One of the areas, deep areas of blind spot for me, Cory, is in all the areas that you teach around sex education, LGBTQ plus issues, trans issues, like in the documentary you asked me to watch, Disclosure, which I'd love to get into, is phenomenal. So I reached out to you when I saw that post, because I know that you've been frustrated with cis men that has shown up. I would love to know, what are the ways that cis men have engaged with you that have frustrated you? And the thing that I said was, I'd love to enter a coaching engagement with you so you could shake all the info that you would want into cis white men that you could. What would that be? So yeah, what are some of the areas of frustration? Maybe you can just start to share some of the scope of work that we've been doing in our coaching engagement.
Yeah. When you asked me that question, honestly, the first thing that popped into my mind is just not all men. Like that whole vibe. I don't know exactly how to identify it, but I get a lot of not all men jumping into my DMs or comments or, whatever.
Wait, do you mean did they're defensive? Like not all men are like this? Is that what you mean? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. People being like, well, you're saying, cis men, blah, 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 but not all men do. I'm like, we know it's not all men. You don't need to tell women or queer people or, people who are not men, you don't need to tell us that it's not all men. We fucking know. We've been here. But the issue is it's all of us. It's pretty much all women or all queer people or all not men, basically. And so when it's that widespread of an issue, clearly all men have a role to play in that. So sure, not all men sexually assault people. Absolutely. Statistically speaking, we know that's true. But all men have some way, shape, or form given way for that to be normalized and for that to be okay in our culture, whether it's through the things that they're creating or the kind of media that is being put out there, or whether it's hearing your friend talk about a sexual encounter that might have not been consensual and bolstering him for that. There's so many ways that the, quote, not all men, there's so many ways that those men contribute to the problem. So I would say that's one of the issues that I come into contact the most. And the other thing to note too is that the men who know that they are not the, source of the problem aren't the ones that are not all men. It's they know, because, I feel like it's very common for people who aren't men to constantly say men are trash. There's a lot of, talk about what are we supposed to do, with these guys. And there's a really great video I remember watching I'm so blanking on his name, but he has a podcast called Poly Role Models. And he was basically giving a talk about that. And he was like, sure, we can get mad about, saying men are trash or whatever, but think about the experiences that person has had to go through to get to the point of saying out loud in a public setting that all men are trash. What did that person experience and go through to get to that point of exacerbation, to say such a sweeping statement? And I was like, that's exactly it. That's it right there, essentially, is that I have personally experienced sexual assault, not only at the hands of men, but majority at the hands of men, of cis men in my life, as well as street harassment every single day, even in the dead of winter when I look like the Michelin Man in my parka. There are no excuses, really. And so, it's been my goal to try to use this platform to say hey, cis men, this isn't a space that's centering you, but this is a space that I would like you to engage with because I think it would be good for you. And especially, now that I'm kind of more talking about birth and, all these things that cis men are historically not really a part of other than in conception in terms of biologically. But I've been really enjoying being able to set this new container. And I've actually got a lot of really positive feedback from a lot of cis men being like, this content is really cool. I had no idea. Or my wife, just gave birth a year ago and this thing happened. And then thank you for sharing this. So I think it's a lot of cis men struggle to understand how to interact in spaces that don't necessarily center them because
that's big.
The world centers cis men.
Cory, can you give a quick definition of that? What does it mean to the content that centers a cis white man?
So I would say this podcast centers cis men, right? Your audience is primarily cis men who are going on, these self-exploration journeys. So this is a great example. And there's nothing wrong with a space that centers cis men. There are spaces that center every type of identity and being and background. And that's fantastic. That's one of the beauties of diversity. But whereas, my content, because I am a queer, non-binary person who is a birth worker, none of that content is really centering the cis male experience. I am centering the experience of people with uteruses primarily, regardless of their gender identity. I'm centering the experiences of women, of trans people, of queer people, people who normally don't get centered in our mainstream society. That's kind of my goal in the content that I put out there, is to say this is a safe space for all of these people to ask questions and express their experiences and connect with each other.
So Dominic, when you reached out to Cory, there was this thirst for knowledge, for there's something I'm missing, but I don't know what I'm missing. And I believe that Cory, based on Cory's content and conversations, has something that I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't know what that is. So, Cory, where do you start with a guy like Dominic? Let's say that Dominic's open.
Yeah. Like when you say, where do you start? Like, here are some of the questions that I brought to Cory, right? It was kind of like, why don't I have more gay friends? Why don't I know any trans people? And I know that these kinds of questions I'm at the center of. Like, I know there's closures, there's a lack of awareness. There's there's like latent prejudices, right? That are preventing me from entering these spaces. And so I think this actually gives way, Cory, to one of the most brilliant assignments that you gave me that we showed up with on day number 1 of our first coaching call. What was the homework you did on me? And then what was the assignment that you gave me to start to wake me up a little bit?
One of the things that you said in our email correspondences, you asked me to kind of just take a look at your last dozen or so Instagram posts. And I went through and I read them. Nothing was extremely problematic in my eyes, so I was like, okay, great. We're starting from somewhere. So I was glad to do that. But, I looked through, and what I saw was a lack of inclusive language and an overall vagueness. And it felt like you're not quite sure who you're talking to and who your audience is. And just as any content creator, no matter what you're doing, that's something that's so important that you have to identify. You have to figure out who you're talking to. And then on top of that, how to address who you're talking to. So that was one of the big things that I brought up is I was like, you keep saying men, but who do you actually mean by that? Because I don't think you're just talking to men here. I think a lot of the things that you're saying can be applied to people of masculine experience. And that's kind of when we started talking about the difference between identity and lived experience and where that kind of separates. And then the homework assignment that I gave you, specifically in regards to social media, was 40 or 50 Instagram accounts to follow. And I don't think there was a single straight white cis male in that list of people that I had you follow. Because one of the things that I did that you didn't ask me to do was I looked through who you were following.
That's big.
And it was primarily straight people, white people, thin people, cis people. And so my intention of giving you that assignment of, follow all these people is maybe the reason that you don't have that many gay friends or trans friends is because you haven't opened yourself to actually be a safe person for these people to be friends with. I remember you saying I don't have any trans friends. And I'm like, well, you probably do, but they just haven't told you.
Right.
That's something people totally forget. And so I had you follow, accounts of BIPOC creators, queer creators, trans creators, body positive creators, fat creators, disabled creators, pretty much anyone who society has marginalized or pushed aside. And I think especially now that we're in this pandemic and we're so reliant on social media for connection, your social media and who you follow on Instagram or Twitter or wherever is pretty indicative, in my opinion, of the people that you surround yourself with in real life. And that's especially true now because we don't see as many people in real life now. And so I think, giving you that was the springboard that I kind of wanted to use to kind of get us into this conversation because I'm only one person and I'm a person of privilege as well. I am white. I come from a comfortable background. And so there's a lot of things that I can't teach you. And these other people are out here doing this work. So engage with it and take what you want from them because, I learn from them all the time as well.
So it sounded like this started with literacy. What are the words? What are the options out there that I don't really understand? What's the difference between biological sex and gender and presentation and everything else? So it sounded like it started there. And then it moved into a space of information consumption so that I can understand, so that I can just understand the perspective, which Dominic is what I think you started off with in terms of I want to understand more.
Yeah.
And so after going through that experience, and now that you're following 50 plus people, what has been that experience for you so far? Where are you at on this journey?
Yeah, great. So, the thing that I really want to double down on what Cory said was, this was a big aha for me was, she said, Dominic, when I looked at who you're following, who we follow on social media is very indicative of either who exists in our physical lives right now or who we aspire to bring into our physical lives. And that was a big aha moment because it was okay, there were some anti-racist educators that I started following. There was a few trans folks who I'd watched go through their journey, but it was primarily, Cory, what you had said, a lot of straight, white, cis, able-bodied folks that I was following. So now 40 or 50 new accounts. And these were the categories you gave me, Cory: anti-racism, body positivity, queer and trans issues, sex positivity, sex work activism, and trauma awareness. Like, I'm only following like 600 people or something like that. Now I've added an additional 10%. So when I go on my social media now, it's a very different experience. And all of a sudden I see Dex Rated, who's, a fat black man who's loving his body and just like, chest out, dancing, twerking, you know what I mean? Like these are the things that are now in my feed. The fat sex therapist, who I actually think I saw at ConsentCon with you, Brian. I think I started following her, years ago.
Yeah, they're awesome.
Right? Oh, they're awesome. So it's like...
Yeah, they use they, them pronouns.
They, them pronouns. Okay. And by the way, like these are the things that I'm going to trip up over as we get on the show. And Cory, please,
that's totally
at
fine.
any point in time, like jump in.
Yeah.
And...
I think I wanted to kind of like point that out too, is that there's nothing wrong with being corrected, but I think we as humans are really bad at like fucking up. We're really bad, especially if it's like a little thing. I could say as a member of the trans community, like if you fuck up on my pronouns, like it's fine. Just be like, oh yeah, my bad. And then move on. It's no big deal. It's not a huge deal. You didn't monumentally fuck up or anything. It's totally fine. It's a learning experience. Like we're all in this together. So I, just wanted to give that caveat of that. If Dominic fucks up, I don't think that, all of this work is just crumbled. It's fine. It's okay. We've only been in this for a month and a half. So I just wanted to give that note.
Well, I think that's really important that we're here on that part of it, because I imagine you encounter a lot of defensiveness when you correct somebody. Like, what are some of the ways that people are defensive on the corrections that shut you down? And then I think you just gave the example of how to handle that correction, which is, oh, thank you, I'm sorry, and then go on. What are some of those defensive things that just...
Yeah, I think defensiveness is a response to being uncomfortable. That's what it boils down to. It's a lot of people just feel embarrassed. And so they just project that embarrassment usually onto the person who corrected them, or in worse situations onto the person they were referring to or misgendering. Some of that, can look like brushing it off as a joke, saying like, oh, it doesn't matter, like kind of belittling the importance of proper pronoun usage, stuff like that. Or a common one is he, she, it, whatever. Like, no, that's awful. Don't say that ever. People are human beings, regardless of their gender identity. That's just a fact. But if someone identifies as it, that's great. Use their pronouns, but they need to tell you that that's their pronouns first. So it's really just people get their feathers get ruffled, and there's, a positive way to handle that. And then there's a negative way to handle that. And it's so much easier to handle it in the positive way. Another thing I constantly see is like oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I promise I'm going to like making it a thing when it doesn't need to be a thing.
Yeah.
It's just oh, my bad. And then change the problem, just fix it. It's such a small, but extremely effective and validating thing, pronoun usage. Because cis people have never usually been misgendered or have had that issue in a serious way. Like sometimes people will, use incorrect genders as a joke. But for trans people and for non-binary people, it's like that is a form of life-saving validation. That is something that directly can correlate to the suicide rates of queer and trans people. Those are things that, we think that they're not a big deal in the moment, but when we actually look at the statistics and what actually contributes to the astronomical depression rates amongst queer and trans people, that's one of the really small but really powerful things that we can all do better at as a society.
Why is that specifically have such an impact on depression rates, suicide rates, loneliness? Why would you say?
Let's take the example of a trans woman who maybe started her transition maybe a little bit later in life. So she, to others, presents or others perceive her as a man or as a cis man, even though she is a woman. And so to be constantly told that you are a man and you are a man, it's just wrong. It's just incorrect. Being trans is no different than, any other birth defect like birthmark or having or being left-handed or having red hair. Things happen when we're born and things happen when we're growing in the wombs. Like all these things can happen. It's normal for for us to need maybe medication support, like if you have a mood disorder, that's a chemical imbalance of the brain. That happens. It's totally okay. Let's take the example of having depression. That's a chemical imbalance of the brain. If someone was like, no, you don't, you're a happy person. And you're like, no, I'm not. I'm struggling right now. Like, my life is really hard right now. And they're like, no, it's not. Like, that's infuriating. That's just like the most invalidating, just like, you don't know my experience, but you're trying to tell me that you do. I think, if that's a good example about how it really, really deeply impacts the mental health and the overall wellness of queer and trans people.
Yeah. To that point, Cory, one of the other great resources that you provided is there's an entire repository that you made available around all the different languages, pronouns. And one of the big defensive things that I experience when talking with other men who are not educated about this space is like, oh my God, it's just like there's a never ending new set of definitions and the language is always changing, and they throw their hands up in the air around that. And I certainly understand what it feels like to be overwhelmed when I see the list and learning the new vocabulary. I remember there was times during our coaching where like you were educating me. I'm like, okay, I need a moment for this to like settle in because I'm learning new stuff. Would you say that there is a need for, like we're talking about now, cis men to build a stamina around this stuff, like a stamina to educate, a stamina to build awareness, a stamina to be corrected? What are your perspectives on that?
I mean, absolutely. I think it's interesting when I hear this argument, because I do hear this argument quite a bit. We never really complain about having to learn new information when it comes to a new app that's just been released or a new piece of technology. I mean, think about when iPhones were first being released, 14 years ago, Jesus, all this new stuff. I mean, no one was like, oh, no, we have to learn this new piece. Everyone was like, oh my God, so cool. Look at all this stuff that my phone can do now. And it was like this exciting thing. And so I think the issue is about reframing it to be like, you're about to learn all this really cool new shit, and you get to use that information to make other people feel better about themselves. And there's really not a lot of downsides to that. It's only if you perceive it as a downside because you maybe have to put in a little bit of effort into learning that. And some of that effort includes taking some space to process it. Like I appreciate in our sessions when you would be like, I need to take a few breaths or a few moments just to like really let all of that marinate. And, like we didn't even do weekly sessions. Ours were kind of spaced out a few weeks apart so that you actually had time to let all of this sit and marinate and, form questions for the next session and, all of that stuff. And so I think, especially nowadays in society, like we're so go all the time. We need to learn things so quickly, so fast. And so with this stuff, this is a lifelong journey of unlearning and relearning. And I am on it as well. There are things that I continue to unlearn and things that I have to prioritize. And I think that's really scary for a lot of people to accept that I'm never going to be an expert on this thing because, we are constantly obsessed with people who are experts in their fields. But I'm under maybe this is an unpopular opinion, is that no one is really an expert. Like there's always more to learn, about any subject or any field, any topic. And so I think if people were just a little bit more okay with the potential discomfort that not being an immediate expert in this certain subject, like that's okay. That's okay. But what matters is that you're trying and you're being genuine. You're coming at it from a genuine place of wanting to learn and wanting to grow. And you're also seeking out that information from the right people. Like the reason I'm someone who can do this work is because I have said in a public setting, like I am a coach. I work with people on this. You can pay me to let's do this work. But I think an issue happens is when people try to turn any queer person, trans person, person of color, anyone into their coach when they're like, that's not what I do. I'm just a person. And I think that's what a lot of people are like, oh, well, then I'm not going to do it. It's like, no, go pay the people who literally do this work for a living. Go pay us and we'll be happy to hold that space for you. And I think that also plays into this sense of it's very indicative that society is catered so much to cis men because this often happens with cis men, just expecting people to educate them on the spot for free without any prior discussion, consent, negotiation, none of that. So I think it's really about finding the right places to actually get educated on this stuff because they're everywhere. Google is free.
Something we talk about on this podcast often is that the masculine is in constant energy saving mode. So we're always trying to find the most efficient way, the path that we've already run 100 times. And this feels like the opposite. It feels like, okay, like we need to create some new paths, some new learnings. So that's one piece of the story. The other piece is a fear that I hear consistently with guys, especially like as they get into their 40s, as we get into our 50s, about becoming irrelevant. And to me, this seems like one of those things where we can choose to ignore this and not create these new paths and not be open to what this is. And I think that's a path towards irrelevance because I don't think this is something. I remember a Simpsons episode one time. Somebody said something about the internet and Homer Simpson said, "Oh, that thing, is that still around?" It's kind of like these are our fellow humans who are identifying, feeling a certain way. And it feels pretty irrelevant. It feels pretty like, I think this is going to go away if we don't step up into it and be part of it. I know when I was doing a lot of the work around the Me Too movement, I had a lot of guys say that I'm just going to wait. I'm going to wait until this whole thing blows over because as soon as I become a quote advocate, then I put my head on the chopping block and people can culture cancel me, whatever that is. So I'm just going to be quiet. And so, Cory, for anybody that's maybe even thinking that right now, like, I don't know if I'm ready to get into this. Is this really that important? Like, what do you say to those guys?
So there's two different quotes that come to mind in regards to that. I want to address the fear of becoming irrelevant first. I wish I remember who said this quote, but when you come from a place of privilege, equality can feel like oppression. And I think that's what I hear a lot. I can say that again. So when you come from a place of privilege, equality can feel like oppression. We've been in a patriarchal society for the past 400 plus years. So that's a lot of build up to this moment now. So we're in it. We're in the thick of it. And so now that we have the internet and social media, which has allowed queer people, Black people, women, trans people, anyone who is not a straight white cis man to have a platform and to build a platform pretty massively, now that we have these opportunities, I can see why a lot of straight white cis men feel that fear of becoming irrelevant because that's not been their experience so far. It's been the straight white cis man show for 400 years. And the issue is when you think in that mindset, you're thinking in the mindset of a starvation economy where let's, think about a pie chart. And you think that there is this that attention or all this stuff is a finite resource. And we don't attention is not a finite resource. We've seen humans' brains developing at faster rates and being able to retain more and more information as society has progressed because we're given so much more information on a more regular basis with the internet and social media and the 24-hour news cycle and all of these things. So I see where that fear is coming from, but I think it is also coming from a place of like, okay, if I'm giving you attention or if I'm giving you power, that means I have to give up some. And sure, maybe that is true. I think that's a conversation that was a really great conversation that was happening back in June of being like, specifically with us white people, like we have to give somewhere. Like we have to drop coin or, give up our platforms. I mean, the CEO of Reddit stepped down and gave his place on the board to a Black man. So yes, absolutely. There are certain scenarios where you're going to lose some things, but are you going to lose everything or are you going to really lose the things that are important to you? And I think the follow-up question for that is that what are you going to gain by giving that up? And I think what you have to gain is so much more than anything you could ever really give up. I forgot the second quote that I was going to say, but maybe it'll come back to me.
The first quote was stellar, so that's
great. I'm glad.
Start there.
That's one that rocked me when you brought it into our conversations. And, Cory, where I'd love to take this conversation to finish our conversation today is really around trans issues. Before we get there, are you okay if I were to share that list of 40 accounts with our audience in the event that they're ready to start doing some more work and following different people?
Absolutely. Please share that away. And you're also welcome to share. We made a list of basically just vocab terms of anything to do with gender identity or identity in overall. So yes, please share that.
That vocab list is a lifesaver and it's super comprehensive. So I'm going to link both of those in the show notes. And Cory, thank you so much for those resources because they're incredibly valuable and a lot of time and energy went into that. So thank you.
Thank you. I also remembered the second quote that I was going to say, and this was kind of in regards to specifically with a lot of guys during the Me Too movement being like, I'm just going to do nothing. A few different people have said this in a few different ways. I know like Desmond Tutu and Elie Wiesel have said this in the same regards, but if there is a situation of oppression or violence or harm, neutrality is siding with the oppressor. So by doing nothing, you're ultimately siding with the people who are doing harm. And it's very clear, there's really no other way around it. And we can look to history of the situations where people did nothing. People, avoided getting into it. How do we view those people now? How do we view, if we're talking about the Holocaust or any other forms of mass genocide, are we really giving a pass to the people who just kind of stood by and did nothing? No, we're like, fuck those people. So just choose wisely because, I certainly acknowledge my bias here, but I think you have such a more rich life to live if you actually choose to stand for something. And better yet, stand for the right side of history or stand with the people who are shouting from the rooftops, like, we need help. Like, there's a problem. We need help. I think one of the issues with the Me Too movement was framing it as a women's issue when it's really a men's issue. We constantly talk about ways to avoid getting sexually assaulted, but we rarely really talk about what actually leads to this normalization of sexual assault. And that lies within men. So I think, if I could have gone back and done anything differently with the Me Too movement, it's like, this is about men. This is absolutely about men.
Yeah. So Cory, I want to dive in for a few minutes around trans issues. And this is one area that I'm woefully uneducated on. And you asked me to watch a documentary on Netflix, which is phenomenal, and I'm going to link it in the show notes, called Disclosure. It's basically a documentary around how trans people have been represented in Hollywood throughout the different ages of Hollywood productions to today. Some of the compelling statistics that I picked up from the documentary, 80% of Americans don't know a trans person. Right, at least consciously. And I know one of the things you said was like, there probably are some trans people in your life that you don't know about because it's not obvious on the surface. The second thing that was really fascinating was GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, did a study of 134 television episodes. And they looked at the representation of trans people in those episodes. And do you know what the number one profession that was represented for trans people? Bri, I'll ask you this. Do you know what the number one profession that was represented for trans people in those 134 episodes?
No clue.
Cory?
Sex work.
Sex work. Cory, you'd be the first person to say that, like, there's nothing inherently wrong with sex work, right? You're a celebrator of sex work. You've asked me to follow some accounts around sex work, but the way that trans folks in those shows have been characterized in those sex roles are demeaning. There's a lot of violence against them. There's constantly these scenarios where someone who wasn't obviously trans was then outed and then beaten or murdered. And if you don't know a trans person, 80% of Americans don't, and you watch a lot of television. And I think back to like one of my favorite TV shows, one of my favorite movies, and this was cited in the documentary itself, Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, right? I know you're a big Ace Ventura guy too. How does that movie end? Finkel is Einhorn. Einhorn is Finkel. Jim Carrey discovers that Einhorn is a man. And then it sets off this like tornado of people throwing up, right? And Ace Ventura plunges his face. He empties a bottle of toothpaste in his mouth. He burns his clothes. He cowers in the shower, to clean off the disgusting filth, right? The insinuation of that. And I remember like 15, 16 years old, not knowing any better, that was hilarious to me, right? And a lot of people who have watched that movie, and actually there was a trans man in the show, in the documentary, who had said that was his favorite movie as a kid also. But when it got to the very end, it was almost like this dagger in the heart of his being because he was being thrown up against. And so if our exposure to trans people is in Hollywood and media, and the majority of that is something disgusting or something violent or something like a betrayal when the person reveals themselves, then that's fucked up. That's really fucked up. And that shook me, Cory. And I'm just curious, what would you have to say about all of that? And for people who may fall into that category of, we are one of the 80%.
I mean, I think, I keep coming back to, you don't know any trans people that you know of. And the reason I come back to that is because, you probably do, but you have not made it apparent to those people that you're a safe person to hold space for them. I think one of the easiest things that you can do as a cisgender person to show that, like, I'm showing up, I'm here, obviously there's more work to do, but the easiest thing you can do, put your pronouns in your bio of its, whether it's your social media profile or your email signature. Putting your pronouns in your bio is just like I acknowledge, I'm telling you my gender identity. It's opening up a two-way street for that. It's like saying, here is me. What pronouns do you use? So I think that's one of the main things in regards to that. And in regards to just the overall, representation, yeah, it's disgusting the way that trans people have been portrayed in media. And, going back to how trans people are constantly portrayed as sex workers, there's a reason for that. And it's because if you're unable to pass, meaning if your gender presentation is unable to present to, the average cis person as the gender identity that you identify as, it's really hard to get a job. It's really hard to get a desk job or any sort of normal job where you have to go through the hiring process. Maybe you took some time off of work for gender affirmation surgery and someone is asking you in an interview, what is this gap in your resume for? There's all of these things, there's all these roadblocks that trans people face in the workforce, and therefore sex work is one of the most accessible forms of income for trans people who have struggled to actually enter the workforce or the legal workforce. So that's the reason for that. Now, we obviously have the power to put an end to that, obviously with legislation that prevents discrimination, that's a great first step. That's not the answer. Unfortunately, we still know that exists. That discrimination absolutely exists. So it's a very slow moving cultural shift that we kind of all have to be on board for in order to make that happen.
So Dominic, after being on this journey for just maybe a month and a half here, I'm curious, there seems to be a lot to gain. And Cory, you referenced this earlier, that to open ourselves up to this, there are opportunities for, like, what benefits do we see? And so, Dominic, from your perspective, like cis white guy, what are you seeing in just the beginnings of this work?
Yeah, I think the thing that I can draw upon from my earliest days is growing up with a sister who has special needs. I have an understanding for what a marginalized person's life is like, especially someone that I love and care about. And Mary was marginalized because of her differences, how she dressed, how, she was slower than others. And I could see the pain in her life, being on the outside. But also, Mary is one of my greatest spiritual teachers. Like, her heart is as big as anyone's. She has taught me so much about resilience in her own special way, right? And so, like in this particular case, like the conversation that we're talking about right now, like are a lot of marginalized people who have beautiful stories of pain, stories of resilience, stories of triumph, stories that are diverse. And, when you watch a documentary like Disclosure, you have a chance to just see how strong and amazing and talented and heartbreaking these stories are. So for me, from a selfish standpoint, I want to have deep, intimate connections with people who have walked that path because I admire these people. Right? I admire the journey that they've gone through, the resilience. I could learn a lot from that. And also I see it as a responsibility and duty, understanding my privilege and how certain areas of my life have been. So a lot of the obstacles have been removed, right? And we brought Giovanni Beckford on our show, a Black man who said, I feel like gravity is 5 times heavier for me than it is for you, right? Like, I've been wearing a weighted vest my entire life. So for me, the benefits are just in the early stages. And like, I haven't scratched the surface here yet. This awareness that Cory's helped to provide me has been beautiful. Her patience with me has been really understanding and compassionate. I also feel safe to ask some of these ignorant questions and to stumble on myself. And like, Cory, to have you kind of standing there and just being like, okay, let me dust you off and then to ask these deeper questions. It's like I start to feel, and I've also started to dissolve some shame that I've had around these areas of ignorance in my life. And as I've woken up over these years, I do have shame carried over from like my teenage years, the things I laughed at, the jokes that I told, and who I was. I didn't know any better. Now, like I have that opportunity to know better and to be proud of the change in the learning process. So those are really big benefits in my life that I feel right now.
Yeah. I think something that we talked about in our most recent session was that patriarchy doesn't actually benefit men in the way that it's perceived that it does. Sure, $1 to 77 cents an hour, sure, that's a different conversation. But if we're actually talking about it, it's like patriarchy places so many constraints on cis men for the way that they're supposed to act or look or behave or exist in private. All these things, like Dominic, you and I were talking about all of the things that you enjoy doing that are perceived as feminine, and how self-care is perceived as feminine. And everyone needs self-care. That's a genderless thing. Everyone needs to learn how to take care of themselves and love themselves. Just give them love. And, we were talking about taking a relaxing bath or putting flowers into your home, these things that are perceived as feminine. It's like these things can really make a difference in just maybe a day. Maybe you're having a shitty day and you just go to your bodega and get a bunch of flowers. Maybe that makes you feel better. That's awesome. But that's one of the ways that patriarchy can be so harmful. It's like those little tiny cuts. It kind of goes back to what we were saying about with pronouns. It's like it's such a small thing, but it's so effective when we do it correctly and we actually give ourselves the opportunity to do that. So yeah, I think it's for any of the cis men, out there listening, it's like patriarchy is not benefiting you in the way that you think it is. And I think that if you were to be able to let go of some of these expectations that society has placed on you or your family has placed on you or your friends or your workplace or wherever it is, being able to let go of that and stop gendering activities, like physical activities, they don't need to be gendered. It's okay to want to get a bath bomb and take a bath, or to go to the nail salon and get a pedicure, or, these things that are perceived as feminine. Those things can be really effective, really powerful. Therapy. Oh my God. Therapy is something that is perceived as feminine or, something that only women do. Therapy has absolutely no gender. Everyone should go to therapy, in my opinion. So yeah, so those are just some of the ways. That's just kind of, I think, the surface of ways that you can expand and actually live a more fulfilled life yourself by letting go of these gender norms and these standards that have been kind of pushed on us.
I think, Cory, that is said so beautifully, because it is a richer life that we can live. When we open ourselves up to these conversations, it's not just having to learn a new vocabulary and having to figure out what is the right pronoun here, but we're actually opening ourselves up to new possibility. The flip side of that is fear. Of like, I don't understand this and I'm going to fear this. I'm going to stay on that path. I know for me, when I inadvertently opened myself up to some of these conversations, because I was just trying to run a business when I went to a lot of these women-run events. And when I opened myself up to these conversations, I learned how to talk about sex for the first time in my life. Like Dominic, you mentioned releasing shame. I didn't even realize I had shame. I didn't know at that time I had shame around sex. My life has been infinitely more colorful. My friendships have been more diverse. And life, if nothing else, has been more fun. Like, only scratching the surface here. I've got a lot more work to do here, but at least I know that if I choose to go do that work, life is only going to open up more. And that to me is really exciting.
Right on, brother. Cory, I wanted to thank you for setting aside time to be with us here today, share your wisdom. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being so patient and such a terrific educator on your socials. Like, that's one of the things that I've been following you for a year and a half, and your content is just lights out. And for the work that we've done in our coaching container so far, and I've re-upped for another round of that. I'm looking forward to our next few sessions. What are the best ways that our listeners who have listened to the end of this episode, who want more of you, can either follow you and or do work with you?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram at the Sex Positive Doula. You can follow me on Twitter at the Sex Pos Doula. POS. I have a Facebook page, but that's mainly just for doula stuff. But while I do prioritize, pregnant, postpartum individuals in my coaching, I absolutely offer coaching for men. And for, specifically this, one of the privileges that I have as a coach who's been in this game for a little bit is I get to kind of pick and choose who I work with. And I really do enjoy this work. So if you're listening right now and you feel inspired to do that, please feel free to reach out. I would love to chat with you. My website is thesexpositivedoula.com.
And I'm going to link all of those in the show notes for your ease of access. Cory, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both.
You know what time it is. It is time to take action on something that you learned in today's episode with Cory Bush about lessons for my sex, LGBTQ+ and gender studies coach. Do not leave this information just in the mind, intellectual exercise. You need to put this into practice. So that could mean going to the link that I provided in the show notes to download Cory's list of Instagram accounts that you can follow to start to diversify who you're following on your social feeds. Because as she said, who you are following in the social media space is indicative of who's in your life right now and who you aspire to have in your life. You can also download her list of all the gender terms, which I found to be an excellent resource guide and quick for shorthand. Take that one thing, that one action step that you are going to bring this into your life so that you can become the greater man within you.